Welcome one and all to the 2022 COPE seminar. I'm Daniel Culp, COPE Chair, and when I'm not doing this, I'm also the Senior Editorial Director for the Journals of the American Chemical Society. I am thrilled to get to the more substantive part of the seminar. Today's seminar comes at an auspicious time for COPE. Not only is COPE celebrating its silver or 25th anniversary, but today we are launching our new membership for universities and research institutes. When we ask ourselves, who is responsible for maintaining the reliability of the scholarly literature? We have, of course, editors and publishers, but universities play a critical role in educating researchers and investigating claims of ethical violations. So it seems right that COPE acts to facilitate communications between editors and publishers on one hand, and universities on the other. They are both invested in the quality of research output, so we can then help them work together to institute the highest standards in publication and research ethics. Today's keynote speaker is Professor John Thompson. Professor Thompson is an emeritus professor of sociology at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of Jesus College. He has studied the effects of media and communication on society and has more recently focused on the publishing industry, especially the effects of digitization as a disruptive force in book publishing, which will be the subject of his keynote today. So, without further ado, I turn the virtual podium over to our keynote speaker, Professor John Thompson.
So let me begin by thanking the members of COPE for inviting me to give this keynote. It's a great pleasure to do so, although I'm sorry we have to do it remotely. Now, I'm very conscious of the fact that all of you will be professionals working in the world of publishing, in scholarly book and journal publishing, and so you're going to know a great deal about the topic that I'm going to be discussing today. I do hope you'll excuse me if you find that I'm covering ground that you're already very familiar with. So, as Dan mentioned in his generous introduction, I'm a sociologist by background, and I've been working on the book publishing industry for the last 20 years or so. I've written 3 books about the industry. The first book was, in fact, on scholarly and academic publishing. The second was on mainstream trade publishing. And the third, which just came out last year, called Book Wars, looks at the impact of the digital revolution on Anglo-American trade publishing. And this is the topic that I'm going to be discussing today. So this book sets out to answer a question, a fundamental question that is simple and easy to state, namely, what happens when the oldest of our media industries, the book business, collides with the great technological revolution of our time, the digital revolution? It's the question that everyone in publishing has been concerned about for the last 20 to 25 years. It's easy to state the question, but it's very hard to answer it. And it's hard to answer in part because the answer is just so complicated, and in part because it's constantly changing. In doing the research for this book and writing it, I was, in effect, shooting at a moving target. And indeed, it's already moved on in some respects since I finished the book. It's important to stress at the outset that my focus was exclusively on Anglo-American trade publishing. I didn't try to deal with scholarly book or scholarly journal publishing, and indeed I wouldn't want to talk about those issues very much today, simply because, to be honest, I haven't done recent research in this area, and I would need to do that research in order to speak competently about what's happening in the fields of scholarly book and scholarly journal publishing today. So I hope you'll excuse me if I focus on Anglo-American trade publishing. In order to understand the impact of the digital revolution on Anglo-American trade publishing, we have to transport ourselves back to the early 2000s, when many people in the book business were looking over their shoulders at what was happening in the music industry and wondering if the book business would go the same way as music. Why not? After all, books could be digitized just as easily as music could, and the old print-on-paper book could be swept aside just as quickly as the old vinyl LP. And we know what happened to the music industry. As digitization took hold, revenues in the music industry collapsed, as you can see from this graph, which shows you US recorded music revenues in the decade from 2000 to 2010. As you'll see, the revenues fell by more than half, a dramatic collapse. There was a steep decline. The story of what happened in the music industry haunted the publishing industry like a specter. And there were many in publishing, and I interviewed many of them in the early 2000s, who thought and feared that the story of the music industry would be their future too, that music was the future of publishing foretold. Now, in the first few years of the early 2000s, the sales of ebooks were in fact very, very slow. However, when Amazon launched the Kindle in November 2007, things changed very quickly. Ebook sales suddenly took off, and it looked to many people in the industry like this was going to be the publishing industry's iPod moment. There was an extraordinary surge in ebook sales year on year. Sales took off very suddenly and increased at a rapid rate from 2008, 2009, 2010, through to 2012. It was dramatic growth. Some of you may recall those years. And many people at the time were speculating that ebooks would become 50 or 75% of the total book sales in just a few years' time, and they might even eclipse print books altogether. But then something equally surprising happened. The growth suddenly stopped. In 2013, there was no growth at all. We know this now with the benefit of the hindsight, but at the time, no one expected this to happen. It came as a complete surprise. If we extend the graph for a few more years, we can see that ebook sales actually declined from 2014 on. And if we superimpose on this graph the rate of growth, which is the red line, we can see that growth rate had fallen to 0 by 2013 and then remained negative for the next 5 years. If we look at ebooks as a percentage of total US trade sales, we see that ebooks plateaued at around 25% of total sales between 2012 and 2014, and then began to decline, falling back to around 15% in 2018. So the broad pattern, now with the benefit of hindsight, seems clear enough. A period of rapid growth when ebooks took off, a plateau at around 25% of total sales, and then a gradual decline. The classic technology S-curve. But this broad pattern is deceptive. If we dig beneath the surface and look more closely at the numbers, things very quickly become much more complicated. Looking at average percentages like this is misleading because different kinds of books perform very differently as ebooks. In order to get a purchase on this, I looked at the proprietary data of a large American trade publisher and broke it down the performance of ebooks by type of book. And when you do that, you see a much more complicated picture. It looks like this. What you see here are the performance of ebooks as a percentage of total sales by type of book between 2018 and 2015. 2008 and 2015. And you see that some types of books have actually sold very well as ebooks, namely the categories at the top of this graph, the ones in red and orange and yellow. Now, it won't come as a surprise to many of you to hear that these categories are the genre fiction and fiction categories. Romance in red is at the top. Mystery, sci-fi, and fantasy in shades of orange are just below that. And the yellow line is general fiction. So with romance, around half of all sales were in the ebook format by 2013. And in fact, this hasn't fallen off much in the years since then. It remains at around half. On the other hand, there were lots of categories of books where the ebook format never took off at all. These are the categories at the bottom, the black and gray and dark purple lines, which include travel books, cookbooks, and juvenile fiction and nonfiction books. And then in the middle, you have the various categories of nonfiction, like history, biography, business, and economics, the blue and green lines. So we need to be very careful about how we interpret these trends. While ebooks have indeed plateaued, some kinds of books have plateaued at a much higher level than others. And for certain kinds of books, like genre fiction, the ebook format remains very important, accounting for around half of all sales by major trade publishers. But there is another reason why we need to be very cautious about how we interpret these trends. The patterns I've been showing you are based on sales by mainstream publishers. But another major consequence of the digital revolution is the explosion in self-publishing, which means that a lot of the publishing activity today is not taking place within the structures of traditional publishing houses. And all of this other activity will be invisible if we just focus our attention on books published by mainstream publishers. I'm going to come back to this point in a minute. Up till now, I've been focusing on ebooks, but in fact, another really important development that was taking place at roughly the same time, that was much less visible to outsiders and much less commented on by journalists, was the rise of the audiobook. Audiobooks, of course, are not new. They've been around since the 1950s. But it was only with the digital revolution, and especially with the development of the internet and the widespread adoption of smartphones, that audiobooks really took off. If you look at consumer spending on audiobooks in the US, you'll see that it began to take off from 2011 on, rising from around $1 billion in 2011 to around $2.5 billion in 2017, an increase of 2.5 times in just 6 years. These are only estimates, but they do show that audiobook sales have been growing at a rapid pace. Moreover, if you look at audiobook formats, you'll see that this growth coincided with the shift from CDs to digital downloads. You'll see that CDs, the blue line here, used to be the dominant medium for audiobooks in the early 2000s. But digital downloads, the red line, were growing fast, and the lines crossed around 2011. Digital downloads are now the overwhelmingly dominant medium for audiobooks, accounting for around 70% of all audiobook sales. 90% of all audiobook sales. And the big player in the space of audiobook downloads is, of course, Audible, which was acquired by Amazon in 2008. At a time when overall revenue in the US book publishing industry was largely static, and ebook revenue for most trade publishers was declining, this strong growth in consumer spending on audiobooks was a major development. For many large trade publishers, the only growth in digital sales they were now seeing was accounted for by audiobooks. This slide makes that point very clear. It shows you the change in publisher revenues by format between 2012 and 2016, and you'll see that the growth of digital download audiobooks really stands out as the key growth area. I've been looking at the rise of ebooks and audiobooks, but it's important to stress that for most trade publishers, the overwhelming bulk of their revenue in the first 2 decades of the 21st century continued to come from printed books. The rise of audiobooks offset the decline of ebooks, but it didn't significantly increase the proportion of publishers' revenues that were accounted for by digital products. This remained at around 20 to 25%, depending on the publisher and the kinds of books they were publishing. In other words, the book publishing industry has not, or at least not yet, experienced a massive shift away from physical formats, as happened in the music industry. So the fear that many in the publishing industry had about the publishing industry going the same way as the music industry turned out to be completely misguided. Books are different from vinyl LPs, and the book publishing industry is different from the music industry. So taking what happened in the music industry as a guide to what would happen in the book publishing industry was a big mistake. And it led many people in the book business in the early 2000s to misunderstand their own future. In my view, what we're likely to see in the book publishing industry, at least for the foreseeable future, is not a one-way shift from print to digital, but what I would call coexistent cultures of print and digital, a hybrid culture where print and digital exist side by side. So does that mean that the digital revolution has had little impact on the book publishing industry after all? Maybe the digital revolution in publishing was a revolution that never happened. Would that be the right conclusion? Well, no, I don't think that would be the right conclusion. But if we want to understand this impact, we have to look elsewhere. Those who thought that the story of the impact of the digital revolution on publishing would be the story of the rise of the ebook were looking in the wrong place. The digital revolution in publishing was never only or even primarily about ebooks. Ebooks were just one aspect of a much more complex series of changes that were transforming the publishing world. I want to focus on 3 of these other changes. In the first place, the digital revolution has completely transformed the retail sector of the publishing industry. The key driving force here was, of course, the rise of Amazon. And it's hard to overstate the significance of this. Amazon has become the most powerful organization that the book publishing industry has ever known in its long 500-year history. And Amazon is, of course, entirely a product of the digital revolution. It simply wouldn't exist without it. So why has Amazon become such a powerful player in the book business? Well, first of all, its success is due in no small measure to the excellent customer service it provides. For book buyers, using Amazon is a very attractive proposition. It's easy to find any book you want and to get it delivered to your door quickly and cheaply. As a consumer experience, Amazon is hard to beat. And publishers have benefited enormously from this too, as it's now very easy for people to buy books regardless of whether they live near a physical bookstore. Moreover, in English-speaking markets where it's possible to discount books, Amazon has been an aggressive discounter, which has enabled it to undercut other retailers on price, and especially to undercut independent booksellers whose margins are often so thin that it's difficult for them to engage in discounting and still survive. Second, Amazon invested heavily in the development of ebook technology, and the reading device it created, the Kindle, was much more user-friendly than the many competing devices that had existed before it. And this helped Amazon to establish and maintain a dominant position in the ebook market. But there's something else that's really important here. It's important to see that Amazon's unprecedented power in the publishing industry stems not just from its excellent customer service and its technological innovations. It also stems from the fact that Amazon, like many other tech giants, systematically gathers user data and turns this into a proprietary resource that it uses to its advantage. I call this new kind of resource information capital. And I argue that this is the basis of a distinctive type of power that I call data power. By accumulating large quantities of information capital and using this to market more effectively to its customers, Amazon is able to establish a special kind of market dominance. Because its power is based on its control of information capital, its power is quite different from and much greater than the power that large book retailers had in the past. No retailer in the past was ever able to gather this kind of data on its customers. This is only possible in the digital age. And Amazon is streets ahead of any of its competitors in terms of the quantity of information capital it possesses. This puts all of Amazon's competitors at a serious disadvantage. And it also puts Amazon's suppliers, that is, the publishers, at a big disadvantage too. Partly as a result of these developments, Amazon has maintained and even strengthened its position as the dominant ebook retailer in the English-speaking world. Most estimates suggest that Amazon has at least 75% of the ebook market in the US, although this probably underestimates the total because it doesn't take account of ebooks accessed via Amazon's ebook subscription service, Kindle Unlimited. Amazon probably also accounts for around 45% of all print sales in the US, by far the largest share, and more than double the share of the next largest retailer, the book retail chain, Barnes & Noble. Amazon also owns Audible, which is by far the most important player in the expanding audiobook market. Estimates of Audible's share of the audiobook market vary from 35% at the low end to as much as 90% at the high end. In any case, Audible, and therefore Amazon, is clearly the dominant player in audiobooks too. So that raises the question, does Amazon have monopoly power in the Anglo-American book market? And if it does, what should be done about it? Legal scholars would no doubt debate and probably disagree about this question. Much depends on how exactly you define a monopoly and how exactly you think about monopoly power in the age of the internet, where online platforms play a new and distinctive role. But without getting into legal and technical debates, I think it's perfectly clear that Amazon has established a position of overwhelming dominance in the Anglo-American book trade, and one that is dangerous for the health and vitality of the publishing industry. It's not just that Amazon is the overwhelmingly dominant retailer in print books, ebooks, and audiobooks, the three key formats of the book publishing industry today. It's also the fact that it is the dominant online platform in the book retail business, and it's able to capture data from all the transactions that take place on its platform, including those by third-party sellers. And when dominant platforms become virtual monopolies, they can also veer into monopsonies that have a great deal of power over the publishers and other suppliers that provide them with books and other goods and services. If you're a publisher and 50% or more of your business is accounted for by one retail channel, as is often the case today with many publishers, then it's very hard for that publisher to walk away from negotiations over terms of trade. And that retailer has a great deal of leverage over the publisher for the simple reason that the publisher needs the retailer much more than the retailer needs the publisher. So there is, in my view, a strong case for subjecting Amazon and other large tech companies to antitrust scrutiny from this perspective, and at the very least, requiring them to divest themselves of some of the companies they've acquired in order to redress imbalances of power and create more diversity in the marketplace. But I also think we need to look again at the legal frameworks that allow both private corporations and states to harvest personal data, store it and use it for their own ends, with very little protection for individuals and a vast asymmetry in terms of knowledge and power between the organizations that own and control this data and the individuals who provide it. Now, not only has the digital revolution given rise to powerful new players who have dominant positions in the publishing field, it has also blurred the boundaries of the field and given rise to new spheres of activity that have taken on a life of their own. The most important of these is undoubtedly the rapidly expanding world of self-publishing. And this is the second transformation I want briefly to mention. Self-publishing is not new. It can be traced back to the 1920s when the so-called vanity publishers began to appear. But the digital revolution completely changed the nature of self-publishing. And it turned the old model of vanity publishing on its head. In the old world of vanity publishing, authors paid the publisher to publish their book, and the fees could be high, anything between $5,000 and $25,000 or even more. But a new kind of publishing ushered in by the digital revolution. Self-publishing platforms no longer charge authors to publish their books. Instead, authors self-publish their books free of charge on the platform. And the platforms pay the author if and when their book sells, taking a commission on sales to cover their own costs. It was this simple but fundamental idea that turned the old model of vanity publishing on its head and underpinned the explosion in self-publishing that took place from the early 2000s on. The world of self-publishing is now a large and complex world in its own right, literally a parallel universe that exists alongside the world of traditional publishing. Of course, many self-published books sell poorly, and thousands disappear without a trace. But that's not true of all self-published books. There are many bestsellers here too, especially in the ebook format. We can get some sense of this by looking at the bestseller lists on Amazon. This slide shows you the sales of ebook bestsellers on Amazon by category, broken down by two types of mainstream publisher: the big five trade publishers like Penguin Random House and HarperCollins in purple, and the small and medium-sized trade publishers in red. And you'll see that the big five trade publishers are pretty dominant in all these categories apart from nonfiction, where they're on a par with small and medium publishers. But when you then add in ebooks by self-published authors and those published on Amazon's own imprints, you suddenly get a very different picture. You see that the hidden continent of self-publishing surges up from below, as it were. This is true in all categories, but especially in genre fiction. In romance, for example, the biggest category is the self-published indie authors in blue. And they account for half of the sales of romance ebooks on Amazon's bestseller lists. As you can see, self-published ebooks account for a pretty substantial proportion of ebook sales across all these categories, and especially in genre fiction. But all this activity remains invisible if we're looking only at ebook sales by mainstream publishers. So if we take account of this largely hidden universe of self-publishing, we get a rather different picture of what is happening to ebook sales over time. We would probably still see the kind of plateau effect we saw earlier, but the plateau would be at a higher level, and the decline may be gentler, and in certain categories like romance fiction, there may be no real decline at all. But there is another thing about the rise of self-publishing that is important here. The growth of self-publishing has also altered the traditional power structures of the publishing field. Publishers and agents have long acted as gatekeepers in the publishing world, deciding which authors and projects should be published and on what terms. Authors were at their mercy, and if a publisher or agent didn't take them on, they didn't have many alternatives. The book into which they had poured their heart and soul would end up gathering dust in a drawer. But now, with the rise of self-publishing, authors have a real alternative. They can bypass entirely the traditional gatekeepers of the publishing world and follow new pathways to publication that have been opened up by the digital revolution. Self-publishing no longer carries the stigma that tainted the old vanity publishers. Authors can actively choose to self-publish, and they can wear the self-publishing label as a badge of honor rather than a sign of desperation or failure. Self-published authors now describe themselves as indie authors, signaling that this is a positive choice on their part, and they're proud of it. They see themselves as part of a progressive, forward-looking movement that is in tune with the spirit of the times. While the digital revolution has brought new players into the publishing field and given rise to new spheres of activity, it's also transformed the broader information and communication environment within which books and publishing exist. This is the third and final transformation I want to mention, and it could be, in the long run, the most important. This transformation is forcing publishers themselves to ask fundamental questions about who they are, what they do, and who they do it for. For most of the 500-year history of book publishing, publishers generally understood their customers to be bookstores and other retailers. Publishers saw themselves as B2B businesses, as they say in business studies. They sold their books to retailers, and they left it to retailers to display books to readers and drive demand. Publishers, in fact, never paid much attention to their ultimate customers, the readers. That was the way the business worked, and publishers were happy with it, so long as they were selling enough books to have a viable business. But as the digital revolution gathered pace, this traditional model that had structured the book business for 500 years began to fall apart for two interconnected reasons. On the one hand, many bookstores were being driven out of business by Amazon, among others. So publishers could no longer rely on bookstores to display books to readers and drive demand. On the other hand, publishers saw that more and more of their sales were being channeled through a new kind of retailer that was working in a very different way. Amazon was acquiring a vast quantity of data about readers and using this data to make its own decisions about which books to make visible to customers, and publishers had no control over this process. Publishers began to realize that the traditional way of thinking about themselves as a B2B business was, in this new digital age, working against them. So they began to see that they needed to become less focused on retailers and more focused on readers. They needed to become more reader-centric. And fortunately, just as the digital revolution forced them to shift their focus and take readers more seriously, it also gave them the tools to do this at scale. Here, publishers took a leaf out of Amazon's book, as it were, and began to develop their own direct channels of communication with readers. Among other things, they began to build their own databases of email addresses of people who were interested in their books and interested in the issues discussed in their books. And they began to open up new channels of direct communication with readers and interact with them directly. Building direct relationships with readers became the new holy grail of trade publishing. And this was not just a matter of developing more effective tools of direct marketing. It was, at least potentially, something much more fundamental than this. It was a matter of rethinking the role that publishers could play in facilitating and participating in a cultural conversation that is now taking place increasingly online. In my view, this is the real challenge that the digital revolution presents to publishers today in the digital age. How do you make your businesses more reader-centric? Engage more directly with your ultimate customers, the readers, and build new channels of communication with them. And how do you rethink the role that publishers and books could and should play in the changing information and communication environment of the 21st century? Despite the disruptive potential of the digital revolution and the turbulence that characterized the book publishing industry since the beginning of the 21st century, the book publishing industry has fared remarkably well, much better than many other media industries like the music industry and the newspaper industry and so on. Book industries have not collapsed. Print books have not disappeared. And even brick and mortar bookstores have begun to make a modest comeback. Counter to the predictions of many prophets of doom, the book publishing apocalypse has not come to pass, or at least not yet. Books, including old-fashioned print-on-paper books, appear to have a place in our lives that is not easily dislodged, even by a technological revolution as radical and far-reaching as the digital revolution. But there are no grounds for complacency. Thanks to the digital revolution, the information and communication structures of our world are in flux. People are communicating differently and spending their time differently. Old practices that worked well in an earlier era may no longer be so effective in this new world of digitized information and communication flows. In contrast to those who fear that screen culture is destroying our capacity to concentrate, I suspect that long-form reading will continue to play a vital role in our social, political, and cultural life for many years and decades to come. We will not easily give up the rich exploration of imaginary worlds and the sustained analysis of actual worlds that long-form reading both encourages and makes possible. But the extent to which publishers will continue to be part of the communication chain through which long-form reading takes place, and what kind of publishers they will be, will ultimately depend on how effectively and imaginatively they are able to adapt themselves to the new information and communication environment that is being forged by the great technological revolution of our time. So with that, I'll bring this to a close, and I'm very happy to take any questions you might wish to ask.
Thank you so much, John. That was a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed it. I see that we have a few questions in the Q&A. The first is a question as to whether or not you can comment on the implications of self-publishing for preprints and the potential impact on journal publishing.
Sure. I'll say something about this, but again, within the limits of my knowledge, because I haven't worked as a scholar on journal publishing. It's a great topic. Someone needs to do some serious sociological research on the journal publishing industry, but I just haven't had time to do it, so I can't speak with expertise about that. I know that there's been a lot of discussion and development in this area, and there already are many pre-press outlets for journal publishing where scholars make their articles available online outside of journals. I know this is a long debate, been going on for 30 years. Others will know much more about it than I do. It's a lively and important debate. I think that debate will continue. I don't see any sign that it's going to decline. I'm not sure that the emergence of self-publishing will be a major factor in that debate, except I would say that I think what we will see, what we already see in book publishing, scholarly monograph publishing, as many of you will know, is that the debate that has been going on in journal publishing since the 1990s about open access is beginning to have a serious impact in the world of scholarly book publishing. It has been for a decade now, and I think that debate will continue. Publishers have developed a response to that. I think myself, a sensible response to say that, open access is certainly a serious, option for academics, but there has to be some kind of be paid in order to make it viable for the publishers. So I think that these debates are going to continue. They're going to be part of our world in this new digital age. As I say, I'm not sure that self-publishing is going to be a major factor in that debate for scholarly publishing for a number of different reasons. One simple reason that I will mention here is because, as I tried to show in my earlier book on academic publishing, which was the book came out a long time ago now, 2005, like an epoch ago. And I'm sure it's greatly out of date. But as I argued in that context, for academics, scholarly book publishing is not just about the economics of publishing. It's also a cultural economy. It's about the symbolism of where you are publishing. And therefore, there is a great deal of prestige associated with publishing with certain academic publishers. Self-publishing, despite the enormous growth of this field, doesn't carry the same kind of prestige as publishing with, Oxford University Press or Harvard University Press or any other distinguished academic publisher. So there's a very different cultural economy in academic publishing that isn't really there in the world of self-publishing. And so I think that's going to be a reason why self-publishing is not likely to have the same kind of direct impact in scholarly publishing as it has had in trade publishing. It has a huge impact on trade publishing, however, and there the cultural economy is very different. So I think I would probably want to answer along those lines. But I do hasten to say that there are going to be many people in this audience who know much more about the debates within scholarly journal publishing than I do.
Thank you, John. Just a quick clarification question. In your last graph, does nonfiction include academic, resource, and educational content as well?
No, I don't think it will do. It'll be mainly, well, let me put it this way. There won't be many there because those lists in the last graph are from Amazon's ebook bestseller lists. And you're not going to find many scholarly books turning up at Amazon's ebook bestseller lists. They're going to be, the obvious nonfiction bestsellers, that you will think of, kind of books that are big ideas books, or works of narrative nonfiction, like, biography and autobiography and memoir and so on and so forth. Those are the books that are more likely to turn up there than a scholarly book on, on a very academic topic.
Very good. Now, can you comment on the extent of how these three changes that you've talked about affect the quality of the content that's out there?
Okay, well, quality is a very complicated, difficult, complex topic. And there are many different ways in which you could begin to think about this. But the most obvious area where we might want to think about this is in the explosion of self-publishing. This is the most striking area where that question comes up. These many platforms that are, and there are many of these platforms, and I spent a lot of time in Book Wars trying to map this universe, this hidden universe of self-publishing, because no one has ever tried to do it before. So I try to map out what this space actually looks like. And the more I immersed myself in this world, the more complex and ramified it became. There are many different platforms, many different players, and so on and so forth. And when you look at these platforms and players, for the most part, they remain agnostic on questions of quality. It's an explicit part of their approach. They say, look, we are creating a platform for authors to make their work available and for readers and consumers to decide what's good and what isn't good. And they will vote with their feet, as it were. They will decide on the basis of the books they choose to read, to purchase, to download, whatever it might be. So the platforms themselves remain largely agnostic. I say largely because it is much more complicated. Every one of these platforms actually will exercise a degree of selectivity, and they do it in different complicated ways, which I try to analyze in the book. Of course, there are they do it first and foremost because they have to comply with certain legal requirements, and therefore they can't just allow anything to be uploaded. And so they do scrutinize and select. But it's not just the legal requirements that they need to satisfy. They also introduce their own judgmental criteria about what they should be publishing and should not be publishing. And there are certain things which are just too close to the edge that they won't allow. So they do exercise a degree of selectivity, but nothing like the degree of selectivity that a traditional publisher will exercise. So traditional publishers, those of you who are involved in book publishing, will know that it's always been a feature of traditional publishers to exercise selectivity, to use criteria to act as a gatekeeper, to use their own criteria to decide what's worth investing in and worth publishing and what isn't. The self-publishing platforms simply don't do that. And therefore they allow lots of stuff. I mean, the numbers we're talking about here are absolutely astronomical compared to what traditional publishers are concerned with. So they allow enormous quantities of material to be published. And so, of course, you might well say, yes, there's a lot of junk that's getting published there because there is no selectivity being exercised. All of that is true. There is a lot of stuff which is not been through a filter of selectivity carried out on either quality grounds, academic grounds, scientific grounds, or whatever. So this is absolutely true. And, it therefore leaves open this charge that, yes, there's a lot of stuff out there, but the quality is not very high. Ultimately, as I say, the self-publishing platforms are agnostic on that question and say, and there is some, they have a point. They have a point. Because let's face it, many publishers turn down books they think are poor that turn out to be very successful. I mean, J.K. Rowling being the obvious example that everyone will be very familiar with. So, publishers, yes, they're being gatekeepers. They are exercising their selectivity criteria, but they do get it wrong. And it is incumbent on them to realize that they make mistakes too. And one of the things that the self-publishing platforms do is to lower the thresholds and let material get out there, and yes, let readers discover it. And if they discover a J.K. Rowling that the publishers all missed, then good luck to them and good luck to the author.
So we have an interesting question here that goes back to sort of the dominance of Amazon in, there's sort of their global dominance, essentially a monopoly, right? Both as a real retailer, but now they're bringing in sort of this influence as a publisher almost. Do you believe that in the future there'll be realistic competition to Amazon, or has it just sort of acquired a mass that's unstoppable?
I think that's a really great question and a very difficult question. And no one has the answer to that question. I mean, there is no doubt that in the Anglo-American world, in the English-speaking world, Amazon has now acquired a dominance in the field of book publishing that is insurmountable. And I don't think anyone can seriously directly compete with them. They are a huge presence, and it's not just. I think it's not just that they have a big market share. It's not just that. It's that they have become the public de facto record of publishing. So, all of the people here who are involved in publishing will know that if you want to find out whether a book is available, where do you go? You go onto Amazon and you check to see if it's available on Amazon. And if an author can't find their book on Amazon, they think it's not published. And therefore, essentially, Amazon has become the public record of the book, of the publication or not otherwise of a book. And so it is assumed a centrality in the field that no other retail organization has. Now, is it a monopoly? Well, I tried to kind of deal with that question in my talk. I mean, it depends a little bit on how you define these technical terms, but there is absolutely no doubt that it has an overwhelmingly dominant presence. And how do you deal with that? I mean, I think myself, as I said, that it has to be examined from a legal and from a legal point of view in the, with regard to antitrust legislation, because it is just so big and so powerful now and has such a dominance in the field that it's become a de facto monopoly and also a de facto monopsony, which for publishers is very dangerous. It means that basically Amazon can dictate the terms of trade, because publishers cannot afford not to do business with them. Not to do business with them is to commit suicide. And so when you have a single retailer which is in that position, then your market is very, very skewed. And so I think it does require legal attention. I mean, will another organization emerge that can compete effectively with Amazon? Well, who knows? I mean, no organization exists forever, so I suppose there will be some competition at some point, but at the moment they're in a very, very dominant position, and whether the world of publishing should wait for another century for another decade for a good competition to arise is a moot point. I think that that really one needs to look at it from a more legal point of view.
So there's two questions remaining. Another one popped up. But first off, this should be relatively straightforward. Within book publishing, especially in the US, is there any type of rules, sort of guidelines around it? I know in journal publishing, there's certain ethical guidelines. We have peer review. But in book publishing, do you know, is there a certain set of expectations or rules in the same vein?
I mean, the short answer to that question is no. There isn't really. I think in trade publishing, every publisher uses their own methods and procedures and makes their own decisions about which books to publish and which not to publish. And sometimes they will get external advice, but often the decisions are made internally in discussion with agents. Of course, agents play in trade publishing, as you know, agents play a hugely important role in a way that is simply not the case in academic publishing. So understanding how trade publishers work means also you really have to understand how agents work. And agents are the first gatekeepers. They're the ones who really do the initial selection and use their own judgments about which projects, which authors and which projects to take forward and which not to take forward. So it's really this negotiation between agents and editors, publishers, where the decisions get taken. And they get taken in ways that are very different from scholarly publishing. You don't do the peer review process. You do the assessments in a very different way. So I think the short answer to your question is no, there isn't the same kind of procedure in trade publishing that you see in academic publishing. There's a big difference between the fields. Now, I should just, maybe it's worth just adding as a footnote here that if any of you've read any of my work, you'll know that I have this approach to publishing, which is called a field theory approach, which means that I don't look at the world of publishing as one world. I look at it as a multiplicity of worlds or fields, and each of these fields is structured in very, very different ways. So you can't deal with them in the same way. So what I call the field of scholarly book publishing is a very specific field that operates in its own ways. It has its own practices and its own principles, its own players, and so on and so forth. And it works in very different ways from Anglo-American trade publishing. It's a completely different field, works in very different ways, and there's very little crossover between them. Not even much personnel transfer between them, because they tend to operate within their own spaces. Promotion tends to operate within a field rather than across fields, and so on and so forth. So understanding trade publishing is, you really can't understand it if you approach it with ideas of scholarly publishing in mind. It just doesn't work like that at all.
Right. So again, sort of weighing scholarly publishing, academic publishing with sort of this area of self-publishing, which I know is mostly trade work. What are the pros and cons of self-publishing, and do you see any type of benefit of moving toward it? So it sort of goes back to that question of preprints versus traditional journal publishing and sort of that.
Well, I mean, as I said before, the world of self-publishing, it is a completely kind of unique and um, uh, different space altogether that works in its own ways. And there are many people in this space who are very, very committed to this space and really believe in this space, both the people who are creating the platforms and who invest a lot of time, effort, and resource in creating these platforms and really believe in what they're doing, but also many authors who are very, very committed indie authors, and who are really committed. This is some of whom come out of traditional publishing and have left traditional publishing and prefer to be indie publishers. They prefer it for a variety of reasons. They can control the conditions of publication much more than if they were publishing with the traditional publishing houses. And also, of course, they earn a much higher return on each sale, much, much higher. I mean, it's completely different from the percentages that they would get if they were publishing with trade publishers or even academic publishers. So they control the finances, they control the production, they control things themselves. And so it gives them much more autonomy, and they're very happy with that. So there are very, very committed indie authors who do this, and there are big returns for them if they're successful. There are, of course, big risks too. And for many people who self-publish their work, it's not a story of great success and untold wealth. It's not that at all, actually. It's completely different from that. It's hard struggle, it's confusing, it's difficult to figure out, and you end up publishing a book that disappears without a trace. That's a very common story. And so the experience of many people, the experience of individual authors will vary enormously. I interviewed quite a lot of indie authors, so I have a good sense of the wide range of experiences. I talk about that a bit in the book, but it's a big topic in itself. So, there isn't a simple answer to that question. It very much depends on where you are located in this field, how successful you are within this field, and so on and so forth. Now, many authors, and indeed many I've also interviewed academic authors who wear different hats. For example, one comes to mind, an academic author, very good academic author who publishes her academic work with university presses, with a university press, publishes her academic books with a university press, and then has another persona as a fiction writer with a different name, where she's a romance erotica fiction writer, and she publishes under a different name, and she self-publishes under that different name. And so she has another career, a very flourishing career as an indie author publishing romance novels on a self-publishing platform, while on the other hand, a very distinguished career as a serious academic publishing scholarly books with the university press. And so for authors, this opens up new opportunities where they move between these spaces depending on the kinds of books they're publishing, what they want to get out of them, and so on and so forth. So this is a very complex space, or a multiplicity of spaces, where individual authors are making strategic choices about how best to proceed depending on what they want to publish and for whom they're publishing it, and what persona they want to be known by for the different types of books they're publishing. So again, this goes back to my early comment. It's a complicated story, and that's why it took me much longer to write this book than I thought it would do, because it is really complex. Of course, it's utterly fascinating too, and for anyone who's interested in publishing and loves books, it's just an amazingly interesting time, because so much is changing, and there are so many new opportunities opening up.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I see we're after the hour. So John, thank you for a fascinating discussion. Thank you for answering all the questions. Thank everyone out there for asking some very interesting questions.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it very much.
Well, thank you for agreeing to come and join us. It has been delightful. So now we're going to take a 10-minute break as we prepare for the next session. So see you all soon. So thank you.